Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. It's been a while since I put out a new episode. It's been like a year, I believe, since any new episodes came out. It's certainly not the case that I haven't been reading anything. I've been reading stuff quite a bit, but I haven't put out any episodes, largely because I was kind of wondering whether the books I was reading were really a good fit for the podcast. I started diving deeper and deeper into a study of Greek mythology, and that's not necessarily the direction that I initially intended the podcast to go in, but it's just become very interesting to me, and so I've been just studying that, but I decided, what the heck, I'm understanding Greek mythology and Greek religion from a naturalistic secular perspective, a sort of Jungian archetypal perspective, as some of my episodes have talked about Carl Jung. I've reviewed a bit of Carl Jung and spoken about the Greek gods a little bit in the past couple episodes as archetypes, and that's kind of the perspective that I've taken as I've been doing my readings. And so I guess I just figured, why not? Let's keep on along those lines, and I'll just go ahead and keep reviewing some of the books that I've been reading and talking about them. Really not so much reviewing. I know I call some of this stuff book reviews. It's really commentary more than anything else. I've made a decision as well, at least a tentative decision, that I'm not going to be reviewing anything more that has been released in the last 22 years. So only stuff from the 20th century or earlier. The newer stuff, I just, because of my format, because I read extended sections of the book, I read not huge portions, but I read I read extended sections, sometimes 5 to 10 pages of the book out loud, in order to have some of the real, original material that I can then comment on. The newer stuff, I tend to feel a little more uncomfortable reading larger portions of it. I feel like you should go out and buy it. Those authors are putting out books currently, and if it was just like a straight book review, I'd be more inclined to say, yeah, those are the books I should be focused on. But because I'm not so much reviewing it as reading portions of it in the podcast and then talking about what I've read, I just decided that maybe older stuff feels a little more appropriate to me. I have been reading some newer books and enjoying them. The Case for Nationalism by Rich Lowry was pretty good, and I was considering reviewing that one. I've got some stuff on evolutionary theory that's more recent that I've considered reviewing, and I'm not ruling anything out right now. I've considered maybe doing shorter versions of the reviews or the commentaries for those books that would only read smaller sections of the text, and maybe the whole episode would last no more than half an hour. But I haven't really decided. Right now, though, I really just think I'm going to focus on the older stuff. So this book here that I'll be covering today is called Greek Religion. It's written by Walter Burkert, who is a German author. The book was written in 1977. The English translation, which I've got today, was released in 1985. And this is the first of several books that I'll be reading that cover a little bit more specifically Greek religion, ancient pagan religions. Part of the reason that I've been so interested in this is because modern monotheistic religions, Christianity and Judaism, Islam, they tend to be pretty orthodox. Even in the less orthodox versions, there's generally like a right way to understand it. There's considered to be, it's kind of a search for the correct interpretation, to propose that the entire thing is simply a metaphor for something else, that it lacks historical accuracy and is really a myth, to understand it as a myth, and to interpret what the myth means, where the myth originates, is to some degree a sort of heresy in modern religions. But Greek paganism has been, there are so few people, not nobody, certainly not nobody, but there are so few people today that worship the Greek gods as supernatural entities. And there are so many people and so many sources that have looked at the Greek gods as metaphors, as archetypes, as personifications of ideas. And even in the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans would understand, in many cases, would understand their deities or some of their deities as personifications of ideas. I think you could find that quite a bit, especially with like some of the lesser known deities that really, their name is their meaning. Like Fortuna, fortune. The name of the deity is the concept that is being personified, and there's often very little difference between the deity and the concept, and they would describe the concept using a personified form as a sort of spirit. But it seems in reading some of these older sources that there was always a sort of blurring between, are these real spiritual entities in the world, or are they just ideas? Are they ideas that humans have elaborated upon and turned into deities? These were even things that were common in discussion back in the ancient world, and just as much or more so today. Well, definitely, I think more so today. So it's more acceptable to read about and study these ancient pagan religions from an archetypal, psychological, metaphorical perspective. And how can we use those ideas to help us understand the world we live in? That's going to generate a lot less pushback than, say, trying to interpret Christianity or monotheism along those lines. Some people do that. More power to them. Jordan Peterson does that to some extent. But that's just not where I'm coming from. I see more of an archetypal nature in the ancient Greek gods. I think archetypes are multitudinous. I think the schemata of the human consciousness are multitudinous. We have all different ideas in our head that come to the fore at different times, different sides of ourselves, different aspects of ourselves that become more or less prominent at different times in our lives. There's sort of a multiplicity to the contents of the human mind, I believe, that mirrors polytheism more closely than it mirrors monotheism. So with that all said, let me go ahead and start getting into this particular book. There are 5 sections in here that I want to read out loud to you, comment on a little bit. I'm not going to do a tremendous amount of commentary in this episode. I really just want to draw attention to some of the aspects of Greek polytheism that I think are interesting and can be relevant to a modern archetypal interpretation and can help you. I'm kind of like trying to boil out some of the nuggets here that's going to help the audience understand what ancient Greek polytheism was and how it worked in the world. So I've got 5 sections I want to read. The first one is from chapter 3, The Gods. And this section sort of talks about the nature of polytheism as syncretic, kind of chaotic, kind of in a constant state of flux. I think there's an important point here about orthodoxy and the kind of orthodox mindset that we as moderns find ourselves in, that always influences, even when we begin to study these ancient religions, we're influenced by this modern monotheistic orthodoxy mindset. So anyway, let me go ahead and jump in here and start reading this section. So the author says, quote, "A polytheistic world of gods is potentially chaotic, and not only for the outsider. The distinctive personality of a god is constituted and mediated by at least 4 different factors: the established local cult with its ritual program and unique atmosphere, the divine name, the myths told about the named being, and the iconography, especially the cult image. All the same, this complex is easily dissolved, and this makes it quite impossible to write the history of any single god. The mythology, of course, may relate to the ritual. The divine name may be etymologically transparent and illuminating. And the images may point, with their various attributes, to both cult and mythology. But names and myths can always be spread abroad much more easily than rituals, while images transcend even linguistic barriers, and so the various elements are continually separated from one another and reformed in new combinations. So, in Greece, very similar cults do in fact appear under the names of different gods. Fire festivals belong to Artemis, Demeter, Heracles, and even Isis. Ox sacrifices, in which the ox slayer flees from the scene of his deed, are celebrated in honor of both Zeus and Dionysus. Maidens are consecrated to serve in the temples of Artemis, Athena, and Aphrodite. A peplos may be woven for Athena as well as for Hera. In particular, it seems as if an ancient great goddess, especially qua mistress of the animals, has been individualized in Greece in various ways as Hera, Artemis, Aphrodite, Demeter, and Athena. The pectoral with the symbols of plenty may be worn by Hera, Demeter, Artemis, Aphrodite, or even in Asia Minor Zeus. In cult, divine names seem almost interchangeable. Cleisthenes, the tyrant of Sicyon, abolished the Adrastos cult and gave the tragic choruses connected with his cult to Dionysus. An ancient indigenous fire festival undoubtedly lies behind the Isis festival at Thyatira. Conversely, the same name may cover very different cults. Zeus is not only the name of the weather god of Mount Lycaon and of the Lord of the Baphonia in Athens, but also of the Philios of Table Fellowship and of the subterranean Mylikios, who may be portrayed in the form of a serpent. The epithets seem to break the contours of the divine personality. The great goddess of Ephesus, the cruel Laphria, and the goddess for whom young girls dance at Broron are clearly distinct, yet all are called Artemis. Different names may refer to the same being, as for example with Apollo and Paeon, Ares and Enyalios, or else they may be consciously equated, as in the case of Apollo and Helios. In this way, a local name is often associated with the common Greek name: Poseidon Arachtheus, Athena Alia, and Artemis Orthea. Myths, too, are like formulae with variables, for which different names may be substituted. Corites or Corybantes dance around the Zeus child, or the child Dionysus. The dramatic rescue of the unborn child from its burning mother is a story told of Asclepios as well as of Dionysus. Conversely, quite separate myths may be associated with the same divine name. Here the most obvious examples are the 2 accounts of the birth of Aphrodite, as offspring of Ouranos or of Zeus and Dione, and the 2 accounts of the birth of Dionysus, as son of Semele or of Persephone. Ancient philologists later established numbered homonyms to solve the difficulty: 3 gods named Zeus, 4 named Hephaestus, and 5 named Dionysus, Aphrodite, and Athena." End quote. So that section I just wanted to focus on because even back in ancient times, in a relatively small area of the world, there was just no uniformity of the stories, of the names, of the myths. One myth would apply to multiple gods. One name would apply to multiple gods. One god would have multiple names. It was rather chaotic. And moreover, it was changing over time. The story from 2000 BC was not the same as the story from 500 BC. The stories would change over time because there was so much of it was an oral tradition. And so as the stories would get passed on, they would change. And they would be different in different regions. And so there was a sort of constant flux, a constant change, and a constant inability for the whole of the mythological picture back then to mesh together into a coherent whole. And I bring that up because so often now when we look back on these ancient religions, we try to seek out, like, what is the official version? What is the true myth? And which myths are like deviations from the true myth. And that's a sort of Orthodox mindset. It's a sort of monotheistic mindset, in a sense, that we believe that we can come to the true story. There was no true singular story. The accounts of Homer and the accounts of Hesiod and the accounts of Orpheus, these different versions, they all were slightly different from one another. And so you could say, well, is Eros the son of Aphrodite? Some stories would say yes. Some stories would say no. What is the lineage of this god or that god? And I think that really puts a stake in modern attempts to recreate these ancient pagan religions by seeking some sort of traditional established version, or to try to say that we're going to have the story now be the same as the story that it was then. These myths change through history. As one tribe would conquer another tribe, they would absorb the gods of the conquered tribe and make them subservient to the gods of the new tribe. And so in that way, the myths would change, the positions of the gods in relation to one another would change. History was embedded in the myths. Changing peoples, changing attitudes, changing cultures would result in changes in the mythology. And so for people now to go back and look at these old myths and say, well, we're going to pick it up where we left off and try to have some kind of a modern pagan revival that doesn't account in any way for the past, 2,000 or 1,500 years of history. It just ignores that all of this stuff has happened, and it kind of proposes that we're just going to pick things up where we left off. To me, that doesn't make any sense. To me, if one were to create a modern version of these myths, the first thing one would have to acknowledge is that Zeus has been dethroned. Zeus has been usurped from his position as king of the gods. The temples were destroyed in some cases. The statues were destroyed. They were turned into Christian temples or churches. Christianity usurped these ancient religions. And to pick it back up and say, all that never really happened in the world of myth, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so I just think that when we look at this stuff nowadays, we have to keep that in mind, that we have kind of become conditioned by a monotheistic, almost archaeological approach to myth, that the ancient story is the right one, and we are obligated to practice the tradition as it was practiced in the ancient past. But that's not the case. That's not how it was understood then, and there's no reason that we should understand it that way today. So that was why I wanted to talk about that section, or read that section and talk about it. So moving right along, So the next one I think most relevant to what I've just read is this section here from chapter 5. And this kind of follows along the same lines a little bit as the section that I just read. Talks a little bit about structuralism as well. So anyway, in this section he says, quote, "Polytheism means that many gods are worshipped, not only at the same place and at the same time, but by the same community and by the same individual. Only the totality of the gods constitutes the divine world. However much a god is intent on his honor, he never disputes the existence of any other god. They are all everlasting ones. There is no jealous god, as in the Judeo-Christian faith. What is fatal is if a god is overlooked. At the harvest festival in the vineyards, Oeneus forgot Artemis, the goddess of the wild countryside, and she took her revenge when a wild boar broke into the cultivated plantations from the wilderness. Hippolytus knows he is uniquely close to Artemis, the virgin huntress, and Aphrodite would not begrudge him this, but when he scorns and reviles her, her dreadful revenge is provoked, and Artemis does not intercede on his behalf. Such is the custom among the gods. None is ready to oppose the eager will of another. We retire. To overlook or despise a god is to curtail the richness of the world, and hence the fullness of man." And then he goes on to say, quote, "Structuralism has recently become something of a slogan in the humanities, and this has also had its effect on the study of Greek religion. After George Dumézil had taken the lead with his attempt to understand the Indo-European gods in terms of the system of the three functions, Jean-Pierre Vernant, among others, enunciated the principle that a pantheon is to be regarded as an organized system, implying defined relations between the gods, as a kind of language in which the gods have no independent existence, any more than the individual words in a language. A sign in the system receives its meaning through its differentiations from other signs, implications and exclusions, parallels and antitheses. The danger in this approach is, of course, that the historically given reality will perforce be curtailed for the sake of the system and its logical structure. Such relationships are good for thinking, but reality does not always follow suit. A certain stubbornness of the facts remains. Just as the Greek mind does not exist as a unified and definable structure, so the Greek pantheon cannot be regarded as a closed and harmonized system. Even if the system could be described specifically for each place and time, or even for each individual, it would still remain unstable and full of gaps in the same way that the experience of each individual, in spite of all striving for wholeness, remains disparate and heterogeneous. In particular, a god cannot be constructed in order to fill a gap. One must come to know him, he must reveal himself, and so all kinds of contingent factors come into play. The language of polytheism can only be learned passively, as it were. It is impossible to have an active command of it. What is present at hand may be interpreted, but postulates of a grammar can scarcely be sustained. The conglomerate of tradition which constitutes religion perhaps owes its particular form less to the cunning of reason than to the cunning of biology. But consequently, there is an inexhaustible impetus to intellectual creativity, albeit more in the style of the poet than of the thinker." End quote. So what we're looking at here are a couple points. The first section that I read there was when he talks about how the Greek was sort of obligated to worship, or at least acknowledge, all of the gods, and to give all of the gods their due. It was acceptable for a person to say, this is my preferred deity. But it was unacceptable to neglect or scorn the other important deities. And this fostered a sort of sense of wholeness. To neglect one of the deities, like Aphrodite, for example, would be to neglect a certain aspect of life, a certain aspect of human existence, to demean a necessary part of life. And so a sense of wholeness was that was achieved when a Greek would say, all of these different gods represent important parts of life. They have dominion over important parts of life. And a person is sort of incomplete if they cut off some of the gods from their rituals, from their worship. They would, therefore, be cutting off a part of themselves, cutting off their ability to connect with Aphrodite and love and lust in their life. In order to achieve wholeness, all of the gods must be at least recognized. And I think that's a real interesting and important part of how that all worked. At any given time, any person would have some sort of a constellation of gods in their world. And then the second section that I was reading was when he talked about structuralism. And I think that, in my opinion, it seems like maybe a slight misinterpretation of structuralism. He's basically saying, kind of in accord with what I read from the first part, that there is no hard, fast structure. There is no, really detailed network of the gods in their relationships to one another as a closed system. It's always sort of in flux. You can't just invent a god to fill a gap. It was very organically developed, and it was changing over time, even with it, from within cultures, within societies, in cities or communities, and even within an individual person. To try to take too strict of build too strict of a structure upon it is to sort of impose an order to it that it doesn't actually have if you just sort of passively absorb what it is and learn about it and not try to impose your own ideas upon it. Just say, well, what is it? The strict structure doesn't really manifest itself. I'm no expert. I'm a layperson. I'm learning as I go here, but I don't know as though structuralism really proposes that all of these things have the strict, I guess to use a sort of language metaphor, the strict grammar and syntax that one would find in like a dictionary when studying religions or when studying this religion. I don't think structuralism really says that. I think it says more that these gods and the way that they relate to one another they exist in the form in which they exist in order to serve a purpose in society. And maybe you could say that the flux of the whole thing, the impermanence, the chaos of the polytheistic system, and the Greek polytheistic system in particular, is part of the structure. The structure doesn't necessarily mean set in stone, like the structure demands a sort of fluidity. But that doesn't eliminate the nature of it. That doesn't eliminate the shape of it, the general shape of things. It's just a little bit more rough around the edges and impermanent than that. So anyway, that's that section. Let's see what else I wanted to focus on from this. Well, let's look at this section here. This is from, what chapter is this one? Also from chapter 5. When he talks about moral conduct and the morality imposed by the gods. So he's talking about the way in which the Greek polytheistic system establishes and encourages a certain moral standpoint and certain moral conduct. And this is pretty interesting. So in this section he says, quote, "In the struggle of Christianity against the pagan gods, one of the most successful arguments was the accusation of immorality, for the defenders of the old order themselves could not avoid admitting its justification. Most vulnerable were the unbridled love affairs of the gods, and most disturbing was Zeus's overthrow of his own father. For many centuries previously, the Greeks themselves had been formulating this criticism of the Homeric gods, and had found nothing in their defense beyond the unconvincing arts of allegory. When contemplating this, the modern observer may concur with the judgment of history, and find in its moral weakness one of the principal reasons for the decline and dissolution of ancient religion. At the same time, of course, he may also take a particular aesthetic delight in the amorality of the Olympians. And yet the problem here is more complex and more profound. Criticism of Homer is very old. Much the poets lie sounds already in Solon like a proverbial saying, and in Hesiod, the Muses' admission that they know how to tell many lies seems to be directed against the Homeric tales of the gods. Towards the end of the 6th century, this sharp and final judgment was formulated by Xenophanes. Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all things which among men are reproach and blame. And when Hera, out of petty jealousy, cruelly destroys Heracles, the question is asked, to such a god who would pray? Plato had only to draw these strains together and systematize them in order to forbid all this, and especially all Homer, in his ideal state. And yet the most important Greek temples and the most sublime statues of the gods were created generations after Xenophanes. People did continue to pray to these gods. Greek religion was practiced for 800 years after Xenophanes and disappeared only at the end of the ancient world under massive state pressure. Quite clearly, that criticism had touched only the surface, not the roots. A comfortable expedient was found in a piece of casuistry. There is a theology of the poets which need not be believed, and at the same time a theology of the polis, which is very much a civic duty. Then there is also the natural theology of the philosophers, which makes an eminent claim to truth, and which may be regarded either in a spirit of intellectual commitment or with skeptical reserve. What is astonishing here is the easy assumption that the polis religion is able to achieve what the world of gods apparently cannot, that it is the foundation of moral order. Sarcastically, Aristotle remarks that the ruler should display great piety because people are less afraid of suffering any illegal treatment from men of this sort. The thesis proclaimed in a drama toward the end of the 5th century sounds even more devastating, namely, that the gods are the invention of a clever politician in order to bind people to laws which could not otherwise be enforced. This implies, however, that the Greek religion may be derived from its moral function. For Aristotle, there is a philosophical certainty that there are gods. The rest, by which he obviously means the whole of mythology and ritual, was introduced to persuade the multitude and with a view to practical use for the laws and expediency. This, then, is the very opposite of amoral aestheticism. Orators might express the same thought in a much more positive way. Those who planted this fear of the gods in us brought it about that we do not behave entirely like wild beasts toward each other. Earlier still, the same argument is put to polemical use. Magic is essentially godlessness, and a person of this sort would stop at nothing in his actions, at least as far as the gods are concerned, for he has no fear of them. Without fear of the gods, all moral barriers fall away. This motif is already contained in germ in the Cyclops scene in the Odyssey. Polyphemus, though a son of Poseidon, has no care for the gods, and hence he is a man-eater. This accords with the question which Odysseus is accustomed to ask when he lands on an unknown shore, whether the inhabitants are wanton, wild, and not just, or hospitable and of a God-fearing mind. The fear of God is the beginning of morality. The attempt may be made to resolve this dialectic of amoral gods and religious morality in terms of a historical development. The mythology would then enshrine a primitive stage, which came into increasing contradiction with the development of civilization and ethics. In a primitive horde, prestige may rest on violence and sexual activity, and rape and robbery may be entirely honorable. The humble and the weak may be accustomed to the fact that high lords can afford to do very much more in every respect, and set themselves as they please above the order of property and family which they enforce. In that case, the Olympian confusions would correspond to an unstable aristocratic rule at the end of the Dark Age. End quote. And then he goes on to say on the next page, quote, ethical postulates can never succeed in mastering the whole reality and nature. They achieve no more than partial clearings amid the impenetrable chaotic mass. Moreover, morality is always in danger of cutting off the roots of its own life. In ritual and mythology, there is obviously a no to every yes, an antithesis to every thesis, order and dissolution, inside and outside, life and death. The individual development of the moral personality, reflected in a coherent system, is overshadowed by suprapersonal constraints. More important than individual morality is continuity, which depends on solidarity. Polytheism encounters fundamental difficulties in giving legitimation to a moral world order. Its multiplicity always implies opposition. Hera against Zeus, Aphrodite against Artemis, Dionysus against Apollo. Consequently, order is possible only as apportionment, moira, as departmentalization. Every god protects his domain. He intervenes if and only if this domain is specifically violated. This is true at first even of Zeus. He guards the laws of hospitality in the domain of house and court, and over strangers and suppliants who have arrived in the protecting domain. Zeus Herkios, Hykesios, Xenios. What happens on the other side of the boundary does not affect him. Asylum attaches to the sanctuary, to the altar. Elsewhere, one may murder. Man must chart a course between numerous claims and necessities. Piety is shrewdness and caution. This, of course, also gives polytheism its ability to embrace a richly various reality, without evading contradictions and without being forced to deny a part of the world. What is more, man is left a sphere of freedom beyond the satisfied claims. For this reason, law and ethics could develop among the Greeks as human wisdom, free and yet in harmony with the god. Wise sayings and laws are engraved on temple walls, but they are always regarded as human endeavor, not divine revelation. Greek gods do not give laws. Nevertheless, the Greek religion, too, is a duty, which is manifest in commands and in threats of the severest sanctions, often out of all proportion to the transgression. Whoever crosses a certain boundary or lays a branch on a certain altar is doomed to die. To this extent, religion appears as the very model of behavior enforced by a "thou shalt not." There is the danger of offending. And if the formation of a superego through education is a fundamental process in the development of the individual, then religion acts as a decisive factor in that process. That there are unconditional, categorical duties is presupposed as something absolute, no morality without authority. In Greek popular morality, this appears as the basic code: honor the gods and honor one's parents. The one supports the other. Both together guarantee the continuity of the group, which is defined by its rules of conduct. Nevertheless, the attempt to tie the gods to morality in a narrower sense is very old. A simile in the Iliad proclaims as a matter of course that Zeus rages angrily against men when, with violence, they make crooked judgments in the marketplace, and drive out justice without caring for the regard of the gods. Then Zeus sends down the most furious rain which harms the fields. In Hesiod, we hear that the eye of Zeus sees everything and comprehends everything. On the many feeding earth are thrice 1,000 immortal watchers of Zeus over mortal men, who keep watch over justice and wicked deeds, invisibly roaming all over the land. Dike, justice personified as a goddess, comes to her father Zeus when she is offended, sits down beside him, and tells him of the unjust mind of men so that they pay the penalty. Whoever offends and contrives outrage on them, the son of Kronos brings from heaven great bane, hunger, and plague. An army is destroyed, the city wall collapses, or ships are lost at sea. Such is the punishment of the god. Moreover, it is the same wrong whether someone commits adultery, harms orphans, or insults his parents. End quote. So this is a tricky section here, and I don't know as though it really can come to a concrete conclusion, but he's talking about the ways in which the Greek gods often are seen to commit deeds which seem immoral to us. And he says right in the beginning that that was one of the early and powerful Christian arguments against paganism, was the demonstration of the immorality of the actions of the gods. He talks about how this may have originated from a sort of early tribal culture in which the leaders were able to sort of promote a do as I say, not as I do mentality, where the leaders of society were able to impose laws that they necessarily themselves weren't always following, and that in such an ancient primitive society it really was a matter of the strong make the rules, and so brutality was rewarded, and immorality was oftentimes rewarded, but with power. And so the morality of such time was sort of different, and yet the leaders were able and willing to impose morality on the other people in the society. So there's that sort of approach. He also talks in here about how even back in ancient Greece, in Plato, in Hesiod, in Xenophanes, there were criticisms of the gods and the stories of the gods, and saying, well, if the gods do that, then they can't be gods. Or if the gods do this or that, who would pray to such a god? So even way back then, these sort of questions were asked. He also talks about how in a polytheistic system, there are different realms that sort of belong to different deities. And so they find themselves in opposition to one another. He says, well, you've got Hera against Zeus, Aphrodite against Artemis, Dionysus against Apollo, especially Dionysus and Apollo, because we talked about this already. The morality that is demanded, or the behavior, let's say, the code of conduct that is demanded by Apollo could be considered as diametrically opposed to the code of conduct demanded by Dionysus. And so to have some sort of singular moral code apply to all the people, all the worshippers by the gods, it starts to sort of lose its logic. And why should we expect a singular moral code to come from a polytheistic system where different gods have different domains? And the idea then becomes, well, in one particular sphere of activity, you behave like thus. And in other spheres of activity, you can behave differently because a different deity with a different moral command is in command of those other spheres. So a singular moral code that applies to all circumstances isn't really feasible in a polytheistic system. He also talks about how morality and duty, as related to religion, sort of serves as a creation of continuity and building up sort of behavioral boundaries that defines what a group is. He says, in Greek popular morality, this appears as the basic code: honor the gods and honor one's parents. The one supports the other, and both together guarantee the continuity of the group, which is defined by its rules of conduct. So to the extent to which the morality serves as a binding agent, then it becomes universal. Everyone must honor the gods, everyone must honor their parents, and honoring these particular gods is what defines the Greek people. So in that sense, the morality is present from the gods to serve that particular role. But I don't think he really comes to, at least in the section that I read, a real solid conclusion about the extent to which this is a challenge and perhaps contradictory, that there is no necessarily clear-cut single moral code, and that the gods may do things that humans even now or even back then would consider abhorrent. And in studying the gods, I think that there's a sort of, if you think about them as archetypes of human consciousness and human behavior, I think a question arises whereby one could say, well, why should we expect a singular moral code to govern all circumstances? Why would we expect that to come from something that is essentially a part of human nature? It's human nature to commit immoral acts at times. It's also human nature to find these acts immoral. We have moral sense because it's hardwired into us biologically. So we have instinctive drives toward procreation, toward acquiring resources and acquiring power in life to help us survive and help our offspring flourish. And we have instinctive moral guides that help us keep cohesive groups, that help us not live in a world in which every person operates on their own completely. Some circumstances demand that, say, Apollo become the more prominent archetypal drive. I think that's, it's just not as clear cut. Again, like we look to a sort of orthodoxy or like the Bible or some sort of written code to say, uniform monotheism that says there's one God, there's one book, there's one rule, there's one set of codes, there's one way to interpret it, there's one truth, there's one moral truth. And it's universal. This is sort of universalism that comes from, that all kind of splays out and develops from the belief that there is one great true God. All right. So what we understand as morality to be might be different in a polytheistic or a monotheistic society. So anyway, moving on from that to this section here. Again, I believe from chapter 5, there's a lot of good stuff in chapter 5. He talks in this section about social roles and individuality as developed in a polytheistic society. So here he says, quote, "The roles offered by ritual are manifold and complex, and not strictly directed toward an identifiable goal. Through them, society is articulated, as is the Olympic family of the gods. In the first place, into male and female, young and old. Thus, among the choruses there are, as a rule, the boys, the girls, and the men. And associations of venerable women also have a place. At the normal sacrifice, virgins carry the basket and the water jug. Boys and youths drive the animals along for sacrifice and do the roasting of the meat. A distinguished elder man begins and pours the libation, and the women mark the high point of the ceremony with their shrieking olology. In the central part of the Parthenon frieze, the bearded Erechtheus priest hands over the papelos to a boy, while the priestess of Athena turns to two girls carrying stools. The older generation gives instructions. The younger generation complies with service. Nevertheless, their role, too, offers opportunities for distinction and pride. Harmodios became a tyrannicide because his sister had been refused the role of basket-bearer at the Panathenea festival. The splendor of a festival derives not only from the dignity of the old, but even more from the charm of the children and virgins, and the radiant strength of the Ephebi. And indissolubly bound to the whole is the song, shaped ever anew by the poets, who make the myths shine in a fresh light, and thus maintain the code of understanding enshrined in mythology as a living language. The roles of the sexes are differentiated. Women are excluded from certain cults, but in return they have their own festivals to which men have no access, such as Skira, Thesmophoria, Adonia. Men regard these not without suspicion, but cannot impede the sacred. By way of contrast, there is the exchange of sexual roles in mummery and festivals of license, and also in connection with marriage, which upsets the familiar status. Clothes and hairstyles are taken over from the opposite sex. And we find youths in girls' clothing, and girls with beards, phalloi, and satyr costumes. Through such grotesque negation, a person is led to accept his or her role. And then he goes on to say, later on the same page, he says, quote, "Even within the existing order, ritual offers the individual certain opportunities for expressing his personality. Two examples may illustrate this. Xenophon, from his share of the booty won by mercenary service, sets up a sanctuary of Artemis on the premises granted to him by Sparta at Scylos. This entails, as his description vividly portrays, an annual festival, at which the whole neighborhood meets with the goddess and with Xenophon. They gather for hunting, eating, and drinking. The goddess bestows all this without eclipsing Xenophon's role as host. The priestly office which falls to him gives dignified form to the proceedings and distinguishes them from the ostentation of a nouveau riche. In Menander's Daiskalos, the mother of the young lover is a rich lady from Athens, who, as we learn, roams throughout Attica making sacrifices nearly every day. This time, she says, Pan the goat god has appeared to her in a dream, and therefore a sacrifice is due in the grotto of Pan, near Philae, outside the settlement, and at the same time this will be a country outing with a picnic. Thus she is able to break out of the confinement of the women's quarters and show her reverence even to the goat god at the expense of her husband. Repressed desires become manifest in the form of pious duty. Polytheism, with its rich sense of reality, offers the individual possibilities for self-realization without allowing him to leave the common ground of what is considered human." End quote. So here we see in those two sections, the first part that I read really about social roles, and the second part about individuality. Now, in the part about social roles, he's really talking about in the rituals, the various sacrifices and rituals which were a regular, ongoing, constant, and incredibly important part of Greek life and Greek religion. Different sexes, different ages, different people had different roles. And you were obligated to step into your role. And there were times when these roles were somewhat reversed only in certain special circumstances. But the reversal and the confinement of the reversal, in a way, reinforced the social roles that were in effect by default. And so this sort of differentiation said, the elders are there to lead and teach. The younger people are there to learn, but they're also there to manifest their youthful vitality in portions of the rituals. The songs were... He says, "Indissolubly bound to the whole is the song shaped ever anew by the poets, who make the myths shine in a fresh light and thus maintain the code of understanding enshrined in mythology as a living language." So the poets are constantly sort of updating and changing the songs, which I think relates to some of the other things I've spoken about, in order to keep things fresh, in order to keep the thing as a living language, he says, so that it's reflecting. These songs and the rituals are slightly changing bit by bit, particularly the vocalization that would accompany the ritual, slightly changing bit by bit, and I think to reflect changes in society at the time, to reflect ongoing historical circumstances. And so that it was both a continuity of the past on the one hand, the enforcement of roles, the enforcement of particular ritualistic behaviors repeated again and again, while also making room for variations, fluctuations, change, and growth in order to keep the whole thing from becoming stale. And that reinvigoration was largely the role of the poets, the role of the creative participants. They had a very important role to play in both maintaining and updating the ritual, the myth, the story, the song. The second part was about individuality. And here it seems to indicate that individuality, to some extent, is more so in the realm of the wealthy. People who can afford to establish new rituals of their own design. Or can, like, he talks about a woman who has a vision that she must make a sacrifice to the goat god Pan in a certain place. So she goes there to make the sacrifice, but she also makes a social event out of it, a picnic, gathers people together and goes to this place, and outside of her normal bounds as a woman in Greek society, stepping out of those bounds within the religious context. So, and she doesn't have to have anybody, verify her vision. Nobody can verify her vision. She simply says, well, I had a vision. I must make this sacrifice in this place. So come on, ladies, let's go have a picnic. The individuality was sort of bound up in the gods. One cannot defy the gods. And so if the gods give you a vision, nobody can really stand in the way of that vision. And so to that extent, the individuality and the individual decision-making of people to worship how they see fit and live their lives in ways that they see fit, the religion sort of manifested and allowed that to happen by its pliability, by its suppleness, that somebody could simply say, well, I had a vision of this and I'm going to have this ritual like this, and nobody would really question it. I mean, I wasn't there, maybe people would, but it seems as though that was sort of accepted. So in modern, more orthodox religions, it's not really as accepted to say, well, I had a vision that God asked me to do this, and so we're all going to go do this particular thing. That's a little bit, people tend to be a little bit more skeptical about that sort of thing nowadays, when it comes, because we have a society that gives so much room for you to just do your own thing. You don't necessarily need to say, God told me do this. But in the realm of ritual, it tends to be much more, this is when we meet, this is where we meet, this is what we say and what we do. And I don't know, I'm sure that that's not an absolute truth, and especially as modern, religions of the past 50 years give more and more autonomy to people to sort of do their own thing. But I just think that's interesting that the religion back then really did give opportunities for individual acts of piety and individual decision making. So anyway, let me move on to let's see. Looks like my last section that I'm going to read here. So in a few previous episodes, I talked about Dionysus and Apollo and the sort of contrast between them. And I didn't really talk much about any of the other deities or what they could represent or how they could fit into modern life. And also from a sort of political perspective. Obviously, this podcast is partly political. So how is it that we can look at these ancient gods and find political directive in them, find political initiative, or like this god represents this particular form of political action? Is that a thing? I think it is. I think that we should take a moment to look at one of my personal favorite of the Greek deities, which is Athena. So Athena is kind of the goddess of several things. She's a war goddess. She carries a spear and a shield and a helmet. She's kind of armored to some greater or lesser degree. She's a goddess of war, but she's also a goddess of wisdom, and she's also a goddess of craft. Three things which are, at least on the surface, perhaps unrelated. And why is it that this goddess is such an important goddess, particularly for the city of Athens, but also for Greece in general, considered so important? What is it that she really represents, and why is she so important? So this section talks about Athena. He talks about a lot of the different gods and goddesses, but I want to just focus on Athena for now. So in this section, when he's talking about Athena, he says, quote, "What unites these divergent spheres of competence is not an elemental force, but the force of civilization, the just division of roles among women, craftsmen, and warriors, and the organizational wisdom that achieves this. It is not the wild olive of Olympia, but the cultivated tree, which is the gift of Athena. Poseidon violently sires the horse, Athena bridles it and builds the chariot. Poseidon excites the waves, Athena builds the ship. Hermes may multiply the flocks, Athena teaches the use of wool. Even in war, Athena is no exponent of daring-do. This is captured in the figure of Ares, but cultivates the war dance, tactics, and discipline. When Odysseus, crafty and self-controlled as he is, persuades the Achaeans to join battle in spite of their war weariness, then this is the work of Athena. And then later he goes on to say, quote, Her most characteristic manifestation is to Achilles. As he grasps for his sword in his quarrel with Agamemnon, Athena stands behind him and catches him by the hair. To the others, she remains invisible, but Achilles recognizes the goddess in amazement. Her eyes shine terribly. She counsels him to check his rage, lightly inserting the words, "If you follow me," and Achilles obeys without question. It has often been discussed how a psychological process of self-control is here anatomized and presented as divine intervention. Athena's shining eyes mark a moment of lucid prudence in the darkening quarrel. End quote. So that section is not particularly long, but I just think that it's something that we should recognize that is often not really recognized, that Burkert kind of puts forward here, and I think I really deeply agree with him that ultimately Athena is the goddess of civilization. If you figure what are the things that are necessary for a polis, for the polis of Athens to thrive, you could say, well, it must have a strong military defensive capability. It must have fierce warriors. But it doesn't necessarily need to be the aggressor. It need not be a warlike people. In fact, maybe it shouldn't be a warlike people, but it should be able to defend itself. The city of Athens should be able to defend itself and have a military. It should have a strong economy. It should produce things. It should be made of craftsmen who build walls, structures, chariots, all of the various material goods that comprise a healthy economy. It must be subject to wise counsel. It must have leaders who make good decisions. Prudence. It must have a balance of these different things. It can't go too far in any direction. It can't go too far towards economic prosperity at the expense of wisdom or at the expense of military preparedness. These different things must exist in a state of balance in order for the city of Athens to thrive. And I think that Athena represents, to some extent, that sense of balance of the necessary components in order to have a thriving civilization. I think Athena is really interesting in that way, in a sense that often she's just not really appreciated in that regard, not really appreciated or understood as the goddess of civilization. So I think that's worth maybe some further examination as I proceed in looking at some of the books about mythology. I'll see where else I can find information about Athena to see whether we should sort of adopt that sense that civilization itself is a thing of value that should be venerated in that way, and moreover is a psychological force in humanity that we should strive toward achieving civilization. We should honor civilization. We should protect civilization. Is it possible to see Athena as the goddess of the state? Maybe. I don't think that it's a good or smart idea for people to fundamentally oppose the existence of the state, like a hard libertarian. A hard libertarian is not gonna value the state as a thing to be worshipped. I mean, that's probably would be the most anathema to any libertarian, the idea that one should worship the state. And I think a lot of Christians who lean libertarian sort of make this analogy that, oh, the left statists, they've abandoned God and instead they worship the state. But I think that the state is a manifestation of a culture. Some sort of government is necessary for every society. And the society, the boundaries of what does and does not constitute a given society, is largely determined by what geographic areas and what populations do or do not fall under the control of a given state. So the state is sort of the manifestation and the boundary creating entity that defines a civilization or defines a given society. And I think Athena represents that. And I think in the polytheistic vein and the polytheistic manner of giving honor to the different gods and the different domains of those gods, it becomes wise and prudent to honor the state as a necessary component. Not necessarily a necessary evil. I don't think that's, Athena is not a necessary evil, but also one wouldn't want to elevate Athena to the point where, all of the other forces of life are neglected. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. Little bit of thought about what it means to honor and worship a personified version of civilization and or a personified version of the state. I'm going to continue on, maybe not the next book, I'm not sure, but I will definitely continue on exploring ancient Greek religion and exploring polytheism as an archetypal framework from a naturalistic, materialistic perspective. I feel like I need to reiterate. Maybe I reiterate this too often, but I'm looking at this not from a supernatural perspective, but from a naturalistic, archetypal, psychological perspective. And I'll keep looking at ancient Greek religion in particular. So with that, let's call it a day. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye.